When American fighters reached Berlin, the P-51 Mustang Revolution, March 4, 1944, 27,000 feet above Brandenburg. Oberleutnant Franz Stigler's gloved hand trembled against the throttle of his Focke-Wulf 190, not from fear, but from something far more unsettling: disbelief. Through the frost-edged canopy beyond the contrails of the B-17 formation, he'd been stalking like prey for the past 20 minutes. Sleek silver shapes materialized where none should exist. American fighters. Here, over Berlin. The impossibility of it seized his chest tighter than his oxygen mask. 300 miles from the English coast. The laws of physics, the calculations every Luftwaffe pilot had memorized, screamed that this couldn't be. Yet there they were, unmistakable, deadly, and apparently unconcerned with the fuel gauges that should have been screaming empty an hour ago. Stigler watched one of the silver aircraft peel away from the bomber formation with an almost casual grace, turning toward his position. The distinctive profile, that long nose, those elliptical wings, the bubble canopy glinting in the high-altitude sun, belonged to the American P-51 Mustang. A fighter he'd been briefed on, yes. A fighter he'd been told had limited range, like all the others. A fighter that, according to every tactical assessment, every intelligence report, every battle-hardened assumption, should not, could not be here. The American pilot waggled his wings, a challenge, an invitation, a statement, and in that moment, watching the Mustang bank toward him with fuel to spare over the heart of the Reich, Franz Stigler understood that the war in the skies above Europe had fundamentally changed. The sanctuary of distance, the protective buffer that had kept the fatherland's defenders holding the line against the American bomber onslaught had collapsed, not gradually, not with warning, but absolutely irreversibly on this cold March morning when American fighters appeared over Berlin like a nightmare made manifest. He pushed his throttle forward to engage. What else could he do? But his mind, trained in the calculus of aerial combat, was already performing different calculations, darker ones. If American fighters could reach Berlin, fight over the target and return home, something unprecedented, something previously impossible, then the mathematics of this air war had been rewritten overnight, and the Luftwaffe, with its dwindling fuel reserves, its exhausted pilots, its shrinking pool of experienced instructors, might not survive the new equation. The Mustang closed the distance. Stigler's finger found the trigger. But somewhere in the back of his mind, in that place where instinct spoke louder than training, a voice whispered the terrible truth he wasn't yet ready to articulate. This is the beginning of the end. She, The Fortress in the Sky, September 1943. 6 months earlier, the American air war over Europe had appeared to be approaching a fatal crossroads. The theory had been elegant, almost seductive in its mechanical simplicity. Build bombers so heavily armed, so tightly grouped in defensive formations, that they could fight their way through enemy airspace without escort. The Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress embodied this philosophy perfectly. 1350 caliber machine guns bristling from every angle, armor plating protecting vital systems, crews trained to fly in combat box formations that turned individual aircraft into floating gun platforms, overlapping fields of fire that theoretically created an impenetrable shield of lead. On paper, in the planning rooms of the 8th Air Force headquarters in England, the mathematics worked beautifully. German fighters attacking a properly formed bomber stream would face devastating defensive firepower. Losses would be acceptable. The bombing campaign would proceed. Germany's war-making capacity would crumble under the weight of precision daylight attacks. Reality, as always, had other lessons to teach. August 17, 1943. The sky above Schweinfurt, Germany, told a different story. Of the 230 B-17s that penetrated deep into German airspace to attack ball-bearing factories, facilities critical to the Nazi war machine, 60 never returned. 60 aircraft, 600 men, a loss rate of 26% in a single day. Another 100 aircraft limped back to England, so damaged they'd never fly again without extensive repairs. Entire squadrons had been decimated. Young men who'd eaten breakfast together in the gray English dawn were scattered across the German countryside by sunset if they were lucky enough to reach the ground alive. The crews who survived told stories that contradicted every briefing, every assurance, every confident prediction. German fighters, Focke-Wulf 190s and Messerschmitt 109s, hadn't been deterred by the fortress's defensive firepower. They'd adapted, evolved, found the weaknesses in the formations. They attacked from head on, where the B-17's armor was thinnest, closing at combined speeds exceeding 500 miles per hour, firing cannon and machine guns in devastating bursts before the bomber's nose guns could track them. They positioned themselves at 12 o'clock high, diving down through the formation, accepting the risks of return fire in exchange for optimal firing positions. They developed specialized tactics, trail attacks, vertical attacks, even experiments with air-to-air bombing. Luftwaffe pilots like Egon Mayer and Georg Peter Eder had become specialists in bomber destruction, developing techniques that other fighter pilots studied and emulated. The concentrated mass attacks, Sturmgruppen, threw entire squadrons of heavily armed Focke-Wulf 190s directly into bomber formations, pilots willing to ram if necessary, accepting catastrophic casualties among themselves to guarantee bomber kills. These weren't the dogfights of romantic aerial mythology. These were brutal, mechanical slaughters. Second Lieutenant Robert Johnson, a B-17 co-pilot from the 331st Bomb Group, recorded in his diary after the Schweinfurt raid, "The fighters came at us in waves, not opportunistic attacks, coordinated, professional, relentless. For 45 minutes we fought for our lives. The sky was full of smoke, debris, falling aircraft. I counted 7 fortresses go down from my position alone. 7. Each one carried 10 men. The defensive fire we'd been promised would protect us? It barely mattered. They knew our weak points. They'd learned. They'd adapted. And we were dying." The second Schweinfurt raid on October 14, 1943, proved even more catastrophic. Of 291 bombers dispatched, 60 were shot down, another 20% loss rate. The formation that returned resembled a flying junkyard. Aircraft with engines feathered, hydraulics failed, oxygen systems shattered, dead and dying men slumped over their positions. The lead bombardier from the 305th Bomb Group, who'd flown every mission since the unit's arrival in England, refused to fly again. Court-martial proceedings were quietly shelved when a flight surgeon determined the man's hands hadn't stopped shaking for 3 days. The problem was devastatingly simple. German fighters operated on home territory. They could take off, intercept the bomber stream, attack until their ammunition was exhausted or their fuel ran low, then land, rearm, refuel, and attack the same formation again on its return journey. The bombers, meanwhile, had to maintain rigid formations, hold steady courses to their targets, absorb punishment without breaking formation, and somehow survive the gauntlet both ways. Allied fighter escorts, primarily P-47 Thunderbolts and P-38 Lightnings, could accompany the bombers only so far. The P-47, a superb fighter, had an effective combat radius of about 230 miles with standard internal fuel. Extended-range fuel tanks helped, but even with 150-gallon drop tanks, the Thunderbolt could barely reach the German border before having to turn back. The P-38, with its distinctive twin-boom design, could venture slightly farther, but it suffered from mechanical problems at high altitude, and its combat effectiveness in the European theater never matched its stellar performance in the Pacific. This created what bomber crews grimly called Indian country, that vast airspace over Germany itself where the bombers flew unescorted, where German fighters ruled absolutely, where survival became a matter of luck as much as skill. Missions deep into Germany meant flying 2, sometimes 3 hours through Indian country each way, 6 hours of vulnerability, 6 hours of watching the sky, counting the approaching dots, knowing that each formation of German fighters meant more fortresses would fall, more crews would die. The statistics were becoming unsustainable. At current loss rates, the average crew had less than a 20% chance of completing their required 25 missions. Do the mathematics. If every mission cost 5% casualties compounded over 25 missions, and the reality was you weren't fighting percentage points, you were fighting exhausted men and damaged aircraft, facing an enemy who was learning, adapting, and growing more lethal with each encounter. General Ira Eaker, commanding the 8th Air Force, faced an impossible choice: suspend deep penetration raids until longer-range escorts became available, essentially admitting that the unescorted bomber strategy had failed, or continue operations, accepting catastrophic losses, hoping to break the Luftwaffe's fighter force before the bomber offensive collapsed from attrition. The choice was made for him. In late 1943, a series of missions to targets near the German border, where P-47s could provide partial escort, showed a dramatic pattern. When American fighters were present, bomber losses dropped by 60 to 70%. When they weren't, the losses spiked toward 20% or higher. The correlation was undeniable, the conclusion inescapable. The bombers needed escorts, all the way to the target, all the way back. But no Allied fighter could do that. The technology didn't exist. The range wasn't possible. Every aviation engineer, every combat veteran, every tactical planner knew the limitations. A fighter needed fuel for takeoff, climb to altitude, flight to target, combat operations burning fuel at combat power settings, and return flight. Add armor, add weapons, add the engine power necessary to compete with German fighters in combat, and the physics became impossible. You couldn't build a fighter that could reach Berlin and still fight when it got there, except someone had, and they called it the Mustang. The revolutionary machine engineering the impossible. The North American P-51, Mustang's path to revolutionary status was neither ordained nor obvious. In fact, the aircraft that would eventually break the back of the Luftwaffe almost failed before it ever saw combat, victim of short-sighted evaluation and initial mediocrity that nearly consigned it to obscurity. April 1940, the British Purchasing Commission, desperate for combat aircraft as the Luftwaffe ravaged Europe, approached North American aviation with a request to build Curtiss P-40 fighters under license. North Americans' response was audacious. Instead of building someone else's design, they'd design and build a superior fighter in the same time frame. The proposal was either brilliant or insane, possibly both. Chief designer Edgar Schmude and his team had 120 days to design, engineer, and construct a prototype. In aircraft development terms, this timeline was impossible. Most fighters required years from concept to prototype. North American promised 4 months. They delivered in 117 days. The NA-73X prototype, which would become the P-51, first flew on October 26, 1940, with test pilot Vance Breese at the controls. The aircraft was aerodynamically exceptional. A laminar flow-wing design that reduced drag dramatically, a streamlined fuselage shaped by wind tunnel testing, an attention to detail in every rivet and panel gap that created an aircraft of unusual efficiency. In raw performance, it exceeded expectations, fast, maneuverable, with excellent range even in its early configuration. But there was a problem. A catastrophic problem that rendered all those elegant engineering solutions nearly worthless for combat operations: the engine. The early P-51s used the Allison V-1710 engine, a reliable, well-engineered piece of machinery that suffered from one fatal flaw. Its single-stage, single-speed supercharger couldn't maintain power at high altitudes. Above 15,000 feet, the Allison-equipped Mustang became sluggish, underpowered, unable to compete with German fighters that dominated the high-altitude battle space where bomber escorts operated. The RAF initially used these early Mustangs for low-altitude tactical reconnaissance and ground attack, missions where the aircraft excelled, but they were essentially useless for the high-altitude escort role where they were desperately needed. The airplane was brilliant, the engine was wrong, and this mismatch nearly ended the Mustang story before it truly began. The solution came from an unlikely source: British ingenuity meeting American production capacity. Rolls-Royce had developed the Merlin engine, the same power plant that made the Supermarine Spitfire legendary, into a sophisticated two-stage, two-speed supercharged variant that maintained power to extreme altitudes. Someone at the RAF test establishment had a radical idea. What if you mated the Merlin engine to the Mustang airframe? The first Merlin-powered P-51B flew in November 1942, and immediately everything changed. The Mustang transformed from a capable low-altitude fighter into arguably the finest high-altitude fighter of the war. The Packard-built Merlin V1650, Rolls-Royce Merlins manufactured under license in America, gave the P-51 over 1,500 horsepower with excellent high-altitude performance. Combined with the Mustang's low-drag airframe, this created an aircraft with astonishing capabilities. But power alone wasn't revolutionary. The P-47 Thunderbolt had massive power. Its 2,000 horsepower radial engine made it one of the fastest diving aircraft of the war. The issue was range, and here the Mustang revealed its true genius. The engineering team had designed the Mustang with internal fuel capacity of 269 gallons, substantially more than most fighters of its size. But the real breakthrough came with the implementation of external fuel systems. By late 1943, the P-51 could carry two 75-gallon drop tanks under its wings, and eventually two 110-gallon tanks, or even larger 150-gallon tanks. This wasn't merely adding fuel, this was reimagining what a fighter could be. The drop tank concept wasn't new, other aircraft used them. But the Mustang's exceptional fuel efficiency, combined with its massive external fuel capacity, created something unprecedented. A fighter with a combat radius exceeding 750 miles when equipped with two 110-gallon drop tanks. That meant the P-51 could fly 750 miles from its base, engage in combat, and return home. The distance from England to Berlin? Approximately 600 miles. Suddenly, impossibly, an American fighter could escort bombers all the way to the Reich's capital. Consider the mathematics that terrified the Luftwaffe. A P-51B cruising at 25,000 feet at optimal cruise power settings consumed roughly 60 gallons of fuel per hour. With full internal tanks, 269 gallons, plus two 110-gallon drop tanks, the Mustang carried 489 gallons total. Drop the external tanks when entering combat, they were empty by that point, having been consumed during the outbound flight, and the aircraft could cruise for over 7 hours, with roughly 90 minutes of that time available for full-throttle combat operations. 7 hours. A P-47 Thunderbolt with drop tanks could manage perhaps 4 hours total, and that included very limited combat time at the end of its range. The P-51 could fly to Berlin, fight over the target for 20 to 30 minutes, and still have comfortable fuel reserves for the return flight and contingencies. Technical specifications tell only part of the story. The human element, pilot experience in the aircraft, completed the picture. Lieutenant Colonel John C. Meyer, who would become one of the war's top-scoring aces, described his first combat mission in a P-51. "I'd flown P-47s before, and I respected that aircraft enormously. Tough, powerful, a magnificent gun platform. But the Mustang was different. It wasn't just that you flew it, it responded. Every control input produced immediate, precise results. The visibility from that bubble canopy was extraordinary. You could see behind you, below you, track threats in ways that were impossible in earlier fighters. And knowing that you had the fuel to stay with the bombers all the way to the target and back? That changed everything. We weren't racing the fuel gauge anymore. We could hunt. The P-51D variant, which appeared in 1944, refined the design further. The bubble canopy, replacing the earlier Razorback design, provided 360-degree visibility. 650 caliber machine guns, reduced from the P-51B's 4 guns, but with more ammunition per gun, provided devastating firepower. The weight distribution had been optimized, making the aircraft even more maneuverable. But these refinements, as significant as they were, remained evolutionary improvements on the revolutionary core concept. This was a fighter that could go anywhere the bombers went, fight when it got there, and come home. German pilots who encountered the Mustang quickly learned to respect and fear it. Lieutenant Heinz Knoke, a Luftwaffe fighter ace, wrote in his diary after his first encounter with P-51s in early 1944. "We had been told these were American fighters with limited capabilities at altitude. Lies, complete lies. The Mustang matches our 1.9s and 1.90s in every respect: speed, climb, turn radius, and they keep appearing where they should be impossible to find. Over Magdeburg today, 30 minutes of sustained combat. They were still there, still fighting, still dangerous. Our intelligence has failed us catastrophically. The Mustang's range advantage wasn't merely tactical, it was psychological. Luftwaffe fighter pilots had grown accustomed to attacking bomber formations in relative safety once the short-range escorts turned back. Now nowhere was safe. Not over the Ruhr, not over Berlin, not anywhere in the Reich. The Americans could be anywhere, at any time, at any altitude. The sanctuary of depth, the defensive buffer that geography had provided, had been erased. By spring 1944, the P-51 Mustang had evolved from a promising but problematic fighter into the weapon that would break the Luftwaffe's back. Not through technological superiority alone, though the aircraft was indeed superior in many respects to its German adversaries, but through the revolutionary combination of range, performance, and numbers that fundamentally altered the strategic calculus of the air war. The Germans thought their air defenses were safe behind the shield of distance. The Mustang proved them catastrophically wrong, and once that shield shattered, nothing would be the same. L'Avenir's The first deep penetration, March 1944. The mission planners called it Big Week, a series of coordinated maximum effort strikes against German aircraft production facilities in February 1944. But March 4th, 1944 would mark something different, something unprecedented: the first large-scale American fighter escort mission all the way to Berlin. Pre-dawn at RAF Debden, March 4th, 1944. The briefing room filled with pilots from the 4th Fighter Group, one of the most experienced units in the 8th Air Force, previously flying Spitfires with the RAF Eagle squadrons before transitioning to Mustangs. These weren't green pilots facing their first combat. These were veterans who'd seen friends die, who understood the odds, who knew precisely how dangerous this mission would be. Major James Goodson, a fighter ace with 15 confirmed kills, sat in the front row as the intelligence officer pulled back the curtain covering the mission map. The red string stretched from England, across the North Sea, across Germany, all the way to a pin marking Berlin. The room fell silent. Not the nervous silence of inexperience, but the profound silence of professionals absorbing the implications. "Gentlemen," the intelligence officer began, "today you're going to Berlin." Someone in the back whistled softly. Another pilot muttered, "About damn time." The briefing continued with clinical precision: bomber formations, altitudes, timing, radio frequencies, rendezvous points, contingency plans. But everyone in that room understood the unspoken significance. German fighters had owned the skies over Berlin since the war began. No Allied fighter had ever penetrated that far, engaged in combat over the Reich's capital, and returned to tell the story. Today, that would change. The Mustangs began launching at OR's 800 hours. 68 P-51s from the 4th Fighter Group, plus additional groups from other units, creating a fighter force numbering over 170 aircraft dedicated to bomber escort. Each Mustang carried full internal fuel plus 2 110-gallon drop tanks. Each pilot carried maps, survival gear, and the knowledge that if anything went wrong, mechanical failure, combat damage, navigation error, they were going down in enemy territory 300 miles from friendly lines. Lieutenant Robert Johnson, not to be confused with the B-17 co-pilot mentioned earlier, the coincidence of names was common in an Air Force of hundreds of thousands, flew as wingman to Goodson. Years later, he recalled the flight. "The weather was good, clear skies, good visibility. We climbed to 27,000 feet, formed up with the bomber stream over the channel. B-17s and B-24s as far as you could see, hundreds of them, each one carrying 10 men, each one depending on us to keep the Luftwaffe off their backs. The responsibility was crushing, but we'd trained for this. We had the aircraft to do it. And after months of watching bombers get slaughtered, we were finally going to make a difference." The German early warning system detected the incoming raid quickly, Massive formations were impossible to hide. The Luftwaffe scrambled everything they had. Fu-190s from JG-1, Bf-19s from JG-3, specialized bomber-destroyer units with heavy cannon armament. They expected the usual pattern. American fighters would escort to the German border, maybe slightly beyond, then turn back. The Luftwaffe fighters would wait, preserve their fuel, and attack the unescorted bombers deep inside Germany. Except this time, the American fighters didn't turn back. At the German border, the P-51s dropped their external tanks, now empty, having burned through the external fuel during the cruise to combat, and pushed their throttles forward. The Mustangs accelerated, climbing slightly to gain altitude advantage. The bomber stream continued its relentless progress toward Berlin. Oberst Johannes Steinhoff, a highly experienced Luftwaffe fighter leader with over 150 confirmed victories, led a formation of Bf-109s to intercept. His tactical plan was standard: ignore the escorts, hit the bombers hard from head-on passes, rely on speed and firepower to down as many fortresses as possible before the escorts could react. But as Steinhoff's formation approached the bomber stream, the escorts didn't peel away. They turned toward the German fighters aggressively, maintaining position between the bombers and the attackers. Steinhoff's formation was forced to engage the P-51s first. The mathematics of aerial combat suddenly shifted. A Bf-109G could match a Mustang in many performance parameters, but the German fighter had already burned fuel getting to the intercept point. The P-51s, having dropped their external tanks, were flying on internal fuel with plenty of range remaining. The psychological advantage that came with fuel security, knowing you had time, that you could accept extended combat without the fuel gauge becoming an enemy, was profound. The dogfights that developed over Brandenburg were vicious, swirling melees where altitude, position, and split-second decisions determined who lived and who died. But they were also fundamentally different from the previous pattern of bomber escort operations. The P-51s weren't racing against the clock, weren't forced to break off combat early to preserve fuel for the return journey. They could stay, they could fight, they could hunt. Captain Don Gentile, already an ace, spotted a Bf-19 climbing toward the bomber formation. He rolled his Mustang inverted, pulled through into a split-S dive, and came out behind the German fighter with a perfect firing solution. His 650 caliber machine guns converged on the 109's fuselage, walking a line of strikes from the tail forward. The German fighter's canopy exploded in a shower of plexiglass. The aircraft rolled slowly to the left, its pilot dead or unconscious, and began its long spiral toward the ground far below. Gentile didn't have time to watch it fall. Another 109 was attacking from his 7 o'clock position. He broke hard right, pulling maximum G-forces that grayed his vision at the edges, cleared his tail, and reversed the engagement. The two fighters tangled in a turning fight, each pilot trying to gain the inside position, the advantage in the spiral that would allow a killing shot. The German pilot was good, experienced, aggressive, skilled. But the Mustang could turn inside the 109 at this altitude, and Gentile had fuel to burn, literally. He stayed in the turn, forcing the German pilot to commit more and more throttle to maintain position, burning fuel at an unsustainable rate. After 3 full turning cycles, the German fighter broke off, diving away, unwilling or unable to continue the engagement. Gentile let him go. His job wasn't racking up kills. His job was protecting the bombers, which continued their steady, implacable progress toward Berlin. Over the capital itself, Hauptmann Rolf Herrmann led a formation of F-190s armed with heavy 30mm cannon, specialized bomber destroyers designed to shatter the fortress's armored structures with explosive rounds. Herrmann had personally downed 17 4-engine bombers in the past 6 months. He knew the techniques, knew the weak points, knew how to kill the giants. He also knew, with increasing dread, that the American fighters were still there, over Berlin. Impossible, yet undeniable. The Mustangs flew top cover over the bomber stream as the B-17s began their bombing runs, maintaining altitude, position, and readiness. Herrmann's heavily armed 190s, optimized for attacking bombers, loaded down with cannon and armor, were at a severe disadvantage against the nimble Mustangs. To reach the bombers, he'd have to fight through the escorts first. He tried. His formation dove on the bombers from high altitude, attempting to use speed to blow through the escort screen. The P-51s turned into the attack, forcing the 190s into turning combat, where their heavy armament and armor became liabilities, not assets. 3 of Hermicon's 8 aircraft were shot down in the first 2 minutes. Another 2 were damaged badly enough that their pilots broke off, heading back to base nursing failing engines and shot up control surfaces. Hermicon himself made it through to the bomber formation, lined up on a B-17, and triggered a burst from his 30mm cannon, saw strikes on the fortress's wing, saw an engine trail smoke. But before he could press the attack, tracer rounds from a Mustang ripped past his canopy, so close he could feel the shock waves. He broke hard left, abandoning the crippled bomber, focused solely on survival. The Mustang stayed with him through the break, through the dive, through every evasive maneuver. Hermicon only escaped by diving to low altitude and running flat out for friendly territory, his fuel gauge reading nearly empty, his hands shaking from adrenaline and the terrible knowledge that had been confirmed in the most visceral way possible. American fighters could reach Berlin. The sanctuary was gone. The bomber stream completed its attack on Berlin's industrial targets and turned for home. The P-51s maintained their escort positions, engaging German fighters that attempted to attack during the withdrawal. Several Luftwaffe pilots, seeing the escort still present, still aggressive, declined to press attacks. The fuel situation alone made prolonged combat suicidal. They'd have to break off eventually, and the Mustangs could pursue. By the time the formation reached the German border on the return flight, Luftwaffe resistance had essentially ceased. The fighters that had survived the combat over Berlin were landing at forward bases, refueling desperately. But by the time they could return to the battle, the bomber stream had passed beyond their intercept range. The P-51s, still flying escort, still maintaining formation, crossed back into friendly airspace with comfortable fuel reserves. Of the 672 heavy bombers dispatched on the March 4th mission, 37 were lost, a 5.5% loss rate. Painful but dramatically lower than the 20% rates of the previous year's unescorted deep penetration raids. More significantly, the bombers had reached Berlin, bombed their targets, and returned. The 8th Air Force had proved it could strike the Reich's capital and survive the experience. The P-51 pilots landed back at their bases in England exhausted, running on adrenaline and coffee. Ground crews swarmed the aircraft, checking for damage, refueling, rearming, preparing for the next mission. Pilots gathered in the debriefing rooms, comparing notes, confirming kills, discussing tactics. But beneath the professional post-mission analysis, everyone understood they'd crossed a threshold. The war in the air had fundamentally changed, not gradually, not through incremental improvements, but absolutely, in a single mission that proved beyond doubt that American fighters could go anywhere German fighters could go, fight anywhere the Luftwaffe tried to defend, and come home with fuel to spare. Luftwaffe Command received the mission reports with mounting alarm. American fighters over Berlin, sustained combat operations at maximum range, effective bomber defense throughout the entire mission profile. The strategic implications were catastrophic. General Lieutenant Adolf Galland, one of the most experienced and capable Luftwaffe commanders, read the intelligence summaries and understood immediately what many of his superiors refused to acknowledge. With the appearance of long-range American escort fighters, the defensive advantage we held through depth of territory has been eliminated. We must now engage American fighters under conditions where they hold parity or superiority in numbers, performance, and, most critically, fuel endurance. This is unsustainable. Our pilot losses will accelerate. Our ability to defend the Reich is in mortal jeopardy. His assessment was coldly accurate. The March 4 mission was only the beginning. In the weeks and months that followed, P-51 Mustangs would range across Germany with increasing frequency, increasing numbers, and increasing effectiveness. The age of the unescorted bomber was over. The age of American air superiority over Europe had begun, and it had all hinged on a single revolutionary innovation, a fighter that could reach Berlin. The collapse of distance, strategic implications, the psychological impact of the March 4th mission on the Luftwaffe was profound and immediate. For years, German fighter pilots had operated with the comforting certainty that geography was their ally. The vast distances between England and Germany's industrial heartland created a buffer zone where Luftwaffe fighters could operate with relative impunity once the short-range Allied escorts turned back. That certainty, that fundamental assumption undergirding all of German air defense strategy, shattered in a single day. Oberleutnant Heinz Knoke, whose diary provided one of the most detailed personal accounts of the Luftwaffe's wartime experience, recorded his reaction to the news that American fighters had escorted bombers all the way to Berlin. March 4, 1944. The impossible has occurred. Intelligence reports confirmed that American P-51s were observed over Berlin, engaging our fighters and subsequently escorting the bomber formation back toward England. The technical experts assured us this was impossible. The fuel requirements alone should have made such a mission unfeasible. Yet it happened. If American fighters can reach Berlin, then no target in the Reich is beyond their reach. We are now forced to defend everywhere, simultaneously, against an enemy who can choose their targets at will. The strategic balance has shifted catastrophically against us. Knoke's analysis captured the essence of the transformation. Prior to the Mustang's introduction, Luftwaffe Fighter Command could concentrate forces based on predictable bomber routes and the known limitations of Allied escort fighters. Intercept coordinates could be calculated, forces positioned, attacks planned with reasonable confidence that the bombers would eventually be vulnerable once their escorts turned back. The introduction of long-range escort fighters destroyed this defensive architecture completely. Now, every mission could potentially have fighter escort all the way to the target and back. Luftwaffe fighters couldn't wait for the escorts to depart. They had to fight through the escorts to reach the bombers, and that meant accepting combat against fighters that matched or exceeded their own capabilities in performance, numbers, and tactical flexibility. The mathematics of attrition, previously favoring the defenders operating on interior lines, reversed. American fighters could choose when to engage, when to break off, when to pursue. German fighters burning fuel racing to intercept positions had no such luxury. The numbers told a grim story. In the 6 months prior to the introduction of long-range escorts, July-December 1943, 8th Air Force bomber losses averaged approximately 10% per mission on deep penetration raids into Germany. In the 6 months following the widespread deployment of P-51 escorts, March-August 1944, bomber losses on similar missions dropped to approximately 3.5%. The reduction was dramatic, sustained, and directly attributable to the presence of long-range fighter escort. But the more significant statistic concerned German fighter losses. In those same periods, Luftwaffe fighter losses over Western Europe increased from roughly 30% per month, replacement rate barely kept pace, to over 50% per month, catastrophically unsustainable. The Luftwaffe was being bled white, not primarily from attacking bombers, though those gun positions remained deadly, but from being forced to engage American fighter escorts under increasingly unfavorable conditions. Major Johannes Steinhoff, commanding officer of JG-7, tried to explain the operational reality to headquarters in April 1944. We are being asked to defend everywhere simultaneously with forces sufficient to defend nowhere adequately. The Americans launch bomber streams of 600, 800 aircraft escorted by 400, 500 fighters. We can commit perhaps 150, 200 fighters to intercept if we strip every defense sector and concentrate everything on a single raid. The Americans know this. They launch multiple raids simultaneously, forcing us to divide our already inadequate forces. When we do engage, we must fight through fighter screens to reach the bombers. The escorts are well-trained, well-led, flying excellent aircraft with fuel to spare. Our pilots are increasingly inexperienced, replacement pilots arriving at operational units with perhaps 150 hours total flight time, 20 hours in type, and no combat experience whatsoever. We are feeding children to veteran pilots flying superior aircraft, and we call it defense of the Reich. The loss of experienced pilots was becoming critical. The Luftwaffe had entered the war with superbly trained fighter pilots, veterans of the Spanish Civil War and the campaigns in Poland and France. By 1944, those veterans were dead, captured, or so exhausted by continuous combat operations that their effectiveness was severely degraded. The training system couldn't replace them at anywhere near the required rate, partly because fuel shortages limited training hours, partly because Allied attacks on fuel production facilities meant less aviation gasoline was available for training, and partly because the most experienced instructors were being pulled from training units and sent to operational units to fill gaps left by casualties. The result was a death spiral. Inexperienced pilots died quickly in combat, creating more gaps. More gaps meant more pressure to accelerate training, which produced even less capable pilots. Less capable pilots meant higher loss rates. Higher loss rates meant pulling more instructors from training units. The cycle fed on itself, compounding with each iteration until the Luftwaffe's fighter force was hemorrhaging effectiveness, even as it fought desperately to maintain numerical strength. Lieutenant Werner Hoffmann, a replacement pilot who arrived at JG-11 in May 1944 with 163 hours total flight time, survived his first 5 missions through a combination of luck and the protection of his squadron mates. His diary entry after his 6th mission captured the terror of inadequate preparation. Today I saw an American Mustang for the first time in combat. I had been briefed on its capabilities, shown recognition profiles, told what to expect. None of it prepared me for the reality. The American pilot saw me before I saw him. My situational awareness is still terrible. I cannot track multiple aircraft while maintaining formation and scanning for threats. He positioned himself on my tail with casual ease. I only knew he was there when my wingman screamed a warning. I broke left as hard as I could, pulling until I nearly blacked out. It made no difference. The Mustang stayed with me through the turn, tightening his radius, firing short bursts that walked closer with each pass. I was going to die. I knew it with absolute certainty. Then Hauptmann Richter dove on the American from above, forcing him to break off. We disengaged and returned to base. I vomited after landing. I am scheduled to fly again tomorrow. I have perhaps 60 hours in the Bf-109. The American pilot who almost killed me probably has 300 hours in the Mustang and 20 combat victories. How am I supposed to survive this? Hoffmann didn't. He was shot down 3 days later on his 9th mission. The American pilot who killed him never knew his name, probably never thought about him again. It was simply another kill marking, another small victory in a vast aerial campaign that was systematically destroying the Luftwaffe's ability to defend German airspace. The strategic calculus extended beyond individual combat. The presence of long-range fighter escorts fundamentally altered Allied bombing strategy. Prior to the Mustang's introduction, planners had to accept that bomber losses on deep penetration raids might reach 15 to 20%. Painful but theoretically sustainable if the targets destroyed were valuable enough. With fighter escort, loss rates dropped to 3 to 5%, making deep penetration raids not just sustainable, but routine. This meant the 8th Air Force could maintain a tempo of operations that the Luftwaffe simply couldn't match. 3, 4, sometimes 5 major raids per week, each one forcing the Luftwaffe to scramble fighters, burn fuel, lose pilots, wear down the remaining experienced cadre. The Americans could afford these losses. They had pilot training pipelines producing thousands of qualified fighter pilots annually. They had factories producing Mustangs at a rate of 500 per month by mid-1944. They had fuel, ammunition, spare parts, and a logistical system that could sustain high operational tempos indefinitely. Germany had none of these advantages. German aircraft production actually increased throughout 1944, but fuel production collapsed under sustained Allied bombing. Having fighters meant nothing if they couldn't fly for lack of fuel. Pilot training suffered catastrophically as experienced instructors died or were reassigned to combat units. The Luftwaffe's last reserves of operational effectiveness were being consumed in a losing battle of attrition that the numbers made unwinnable. Reichsmarshal Hermann Goering, commander of the Luftwaffe, oscillated between denying the crisis and blaming his pilots for lacking fighting spirit. In a particularly revealing meeting with fighter unit commanders in June 1944, Goering insisted that German fighters should simply show more courage and press home attacks regardless of the American escorts. General Lieutenant Adolf Galland, present at the meeting, attempted to explain the mathematical reality: fuel consumption rates, replacement pilot training deficiencies, the performance characteristics of the P-51 versus German fighters at various altitudes. Goering dismissed the explanations as excuses, insisting that superior German will could overcome material disadvantages. Galland later wrote in his memoirs, "That meeting convinced me that Goering had lost touch with the reality of the air war completely. He genuinely seemed to believe that our difficulties stemmed from lack of courage rather than material inferiority, numerical disadvantage, and the catastrophic introduction of American long-range fighters that had destroyed our defensive strategy. When I attempted to explain that the P-51 could escort bombers to any target in Germany, fight at altitude with performance matching or exceeding our best fighters, and return home with fuel reserves, he accused me of the defeatism." The man lived in a fantasy world where German superiority was inherent, and any setback must therefore be the result of moral failure rather than operational reality. The divergence between Goering's fantasies and battlefield reality created a command structure paralysis. Units at the front desperately needed tactical flexibility, authorization to preserve their forces rather than throw them into hopeless engagements, permission to acknowledge that the strategic situation had changed fundamentally. Instead, they received orders to attack regardless of losses, to show aggressive spirit, to maintain pressure on the bomber formations, even as the presence of long-range escorts made such attacks increasingly suicidal. The result was predictable. Experienced pilots began to die at accelerating rates, not because they lacked skill or courage, but because they were being ordered to execute tactics that had been obsolete since March 1944. Attack bomber formations despite fighter escort. Ignore your fuel state. Press home attacks, even if it means accepting catastrophic casualties. These weren't tactics. They were death sentences dressed up as orders. By summer 1944, the Luftwaffe's fighter force over Western Europe was approaching collapse. Not dramatic, sudden collapse, the kind that produces headlines and marks clear historical turning points. Rather, a grinding, incremental erosion where each mission cost more than could be replaced. Each combat eroded the remaining pool of experienced pilots. Each week saw the gap between American capabilities and German response widen further. The strategic implications extended far beyond the immediate aerial combat. With American fighters able to escort bombers anywhere in Germany, the Allied bombing campaign could target oil production facilities, ball-bearing plants, aircraft factories, transportation networks, all the industrial infrastructure that sustained the German war effort. And they could do so repeatedly, systematically, without accepting unsustainable losses. The destruction of German oil production proved particularly catastrophic. Synthetic fuel plants, which provided the majority of Germany's aviation gasoline, became priority targets in May 1944, with P-51 escorts protecting the bomber formations all the way to these targets and back. The 8th Air Force could strike them repeatedly, rebuilding faster than the Germans could rebuild. By September 1944, German aviation fuel production had dropped to approximately 20% of pre-campaign levels. This created a vicious cycle. Less fuel meant less training for pilots, fewer operational sorties, reduced ability to defend against further attacks on fuel production, which meant even less fuel, which compounded all the problems. Hauptmann Heinz Baer, a highly experienced fighter ace with over 200 victories, described the fuel crisis in stark terms. By August 1944, we were rationing fuel to the point where operational squadrons received allocation sufficient for perhaps one mission every 2 days. Training units had almost no fuel at all. Replacement pilots arrived at the front with minimal flight time and essentially no advanced combat training. We were expected to defend the Reich with novices flying on fumes. Meanwhile, the Americans flew multiple missions daily, their fighters ranging across Germany at will. The war in the air was already lost. We just hadn't officially acknowledged it yet. The psychological impact on German civilians was equally profound. For years, Nazi propaganda had assured the German people that the Luftwaffe protected the fatherland, that enemy bombers would never reach German cities, that the Reich's air defenses were impenetrable. The appearance of American fighters over Berlin, the capital itself supposedly invulnerable, shattered those assurances completely. Berliners who had believed the propaganda watched contrails high above the city as American Mustangs and German fighters tangled in aerial combat over their homes. They watched bomber formations parade across the sky in broad daylight, almost contemptuous in their disregard for German air defenses. They experienced the bombing raids that followed, the destruction, the casualties, the gradual but inexorable degradation of the city's infrastructure and services. Maria Engelmann, a Berlin housewife who kept a detailed diary throughout the war, recorded her reaction to the first appearance of American fighters over the capital. March 4, 1944. Air raid sirens sounded at 11:47. We went to the shelter as always, but this time was different. Through the shelter's narrow windows, we could see contrails high above, dozens of them crisscrossing the sky in patterns I'd never seen before. Someone said the Americans had brought fighters all the way to Berlin. I didn't believe it at first. Impossible. The distances were too great, but the dogfights continued for over 30 minutes. We could hear the machine guns, faint and distant but unmistakable. When the all clear finally sounded, everyone in the shelter was silent. No one wanted to speak the obvious truth. If American fighters could reach Berlin, then we were no longer safe. The Luftwaffe couldn't protect us. The propaganda had been lies. We were vulnerable, and the war was coming to us whether we wanted to acknowledge it or not. That sense of vulnerability, that collapse of the protective illusions that propaganda had constructed, spread through the German population as the bombing campaign intensified. The Mustangs hadn't just broken the Luftwaffe's defensive capabilities, they'd broken the psychological contract between the Nazi regime and the German people, the implicit promise that the homeland would remain safe, even as the army fought across Europe and Russia. The P-51 Mustang in this broader context was more than just an exceptional fighter aircraft. It was a weapon that changed the fundamental structure of the air war, that rendered obsolete all previous calculations and assumptions, that created strategic possibilities for the Allies while eliminating strategic options for Germany. One aircraft, through the revolutionary combination of range and performance, had accomplished what years of bombing raids had failed to achieve: the systematic destruction of German air defenses and the establishment of absolute Allied air superiority over Europe. The human cost, pilot experiences. The statistics of the air war: thousands of aircraft, tens of thousands of sorties, hundreds of thousands of casualties, can obscure the individual human experiences that gave those numbers meaning. For the pilots who flew the P-51 Mustang and the German pilots who faced them, the revolution in air combat was intensely personal, measured not in strategic abstractions, but in moments of terror, triumph, loss, and survival. Captain Charles Chuck Yeager, who would later become the first pilot to break the sound barrier, flew P-51s with the 305th 7th Fighter Group throughout 1944. His memories of combat over Germany captured the peculiar mixture of professional detachment and visceral intensity that characterized fighter-pilot experience. You're at 25,000 feet, minus 40 degrees outside, your breath fogging the oxygen mask, constantly scanning the sky for threats. You're part of a formation protecting 600 bombers carrying 6,000 men. The responsibility is immense. But when the Germans hit, all that abstracts away. It becomes intensely personal, intensely immediate. You see a 109 lining up on a bomber. You roll, dive, close the distance. Your fingers find the trigger. The 650s light up. You see strikes on his wing, his engine, smoke, pieces breaking away. The enemy fighter rolls over and falls. And you feel, what? Satisfaction? Guilt? Mostly you feel nothing. You just cleared a threat. You move to the next one. The emotional processing comes later, if it comes at all. Jaeger was shot down over France in March 1944, but evaded capture with the help of the French resistance and returned to England. He was supposed to be sent home. Regulations prohibited returned evaders from flying combat missions over Europe, fearing they might be captured again and forced to reveal resistance networks. Jaeger appealed directly to General Eisenhower for permission to return to combat. Permission was granted, and Jaeger went on to become one of the war's top aces, credited with 11.5 aerial victories, including a stunning mission on October 12, 1944, where he shot down 5 German fighters in a single sortie. But for every ace like Jaeger who survived and thrived, there were dozens of pilots who died in their first few missions, or were shot down and captured, or simply disappeared over enemy territory with no one ever knowing exactly what happened. The life expectancy of replacement pilots arriving at operational units in 1944 was brutally short. Some units lost 50% of their replacement pilots in the first 5 missions. Combat was a ruthlessly efficient filtering mechanism, sorting those with the combination of skill, situational awareness, and luck necessary to survive from those who lacked any one of those essential elements. Lieutenant Robert Johnson, a different Robert Johnson from the B-17 co-pilot and the P-51 pilot mentioned earlier, the name was remarkably common, arrived at the 56th Fighter Group in late 1943 flying P-47 Thunderbolts. He survived to transition to P-51s in early 1944 and recorded in his memoirs the terror of early combat missions. My first real dogfight, not training, not exercises, but actual combat where someone was actively trying to kill me, was over Hamburg in January 1944. I was flying wing on a veteran pilot when German fighters bounced us from above. He called brake right. I broke. A 190 flashed past me so close I could see the pilot's face. Young, looked terrified, which made 2 of us. I tried to reverse on him but lost sight in the turn. Suddenly tracers everywhere. My wingman was screaming warnings I couldn't process. I broke left, right, dove, climbed, lost all situational awareness. When I finally sorted myself out, I was alone, at 15,000 feet, with no idea where my formation was. I radioed, no response. I was convinced I'd died without realizing it. Then my flight leader's voice, calm and professional. "Johnson, where the hell are you?" I'd survived. Barely. But I'd learned more in those 5 minutes than in 200 hours of training. Johnson survived the war with 7 confirmed victories. His survival was not inevitable, not guaranteed, and not due to any inherent superiority. He survived because he learned quickly, because his wingmen protected him through his early missions, and because he was lucky. He watched friends die. He watched replacement pilots arrive, barely know their names, and then file loss reports when they didn't return. The randomness of survival haunted him for decades after the war ended. The German experience was, if anything, more psychologically devastating. Luftwaffe pilots faced not just the immediate dangers of combat, but the growing awareness that they were fighting a losing battle, that each mission diminished their already inadequate forces, that the strategic situation was hopeless, regardless of individual courage or skill. Lieutenant Hans Joachim Jabs, a night fighter pilot with over 50 confirmed victories against RAF bombers, was transferred to day fighter operations in spring 1944 as the crisis in air defense deepened. His diary recorded the psychological trauma of transitioning from successful night operations, where German technology and tactics still held advantages, to day operations where American fighters dominated. April 23, 1944. First day mission against American bomber formation. We scrambled 12 fighters from our airfield. By the time we reached intercept altitude, the Americans had 400 bombers escorted by what seemed like 300 fighters. Our 12 fighters, against 700 aircraft. What were we supposed to accomplish? We attacked anyway, because those were our orders. I made one pass at a bomber, saw strikes, then P-51s were everywhere. I broke off, ran for cloud cover, and barely made it back to base. Of our 12 fighters, 4 didn't return. 2 more were so damaged they'll never fly again. 6 aircraft and 5 pilots lost. For what? We didn't stop the bombers. We barely inconvenienced them. This is not combat. This is execution. Jabs survived the war, but was profoundly affected by the experience. In post-war interviews, he described the psychological impact of knowing you were doomed, that each mission was simply delaying the inevitable. The worst part wasn't the combat itself. Combat is immediate, visceral, focused. The worst part was landing back at base, seeing the empty dispersals where your friend's aircraft should have been, knowing that tomorrow you'd fly again, and the day after, and the day after that, until statistically your dispersal would be the empty one. There was no hope of winning. The best you could hope for was survival until the war ended. That knowledge that you were fighting without possibility of victory was psychologically crushing. The Luftwaffe's pilot retention problem wasn't just about casualties. Experienced pilots who survived month after month of impossible missions suffered psychological breakdown at increasing rates. Combat fatigue, what would later be called PTSD, was epidemic among veteran fighter pilots by late 1944. Some simply refused to fly. Others flew, but were shadows of their former effectiveness. Reactions slowed, situational awareness diminished, fighting more from instinct and muscle memory than from sharp cognitive processing. Major Eric Hartmann, the highest-scoring fighter ace in history with 352 confirmed victories, almost all on the Eastern Front, was briefly transferred to the West in 1944. He flew several missions against American bomber formations and escort fighters before being sent back east. His assessment of the Western Air War was bleak. In the East, we still had tactical opportunities. We could choose when to engage, could use our experience and skill to offset numerical disadvantages. In the West, against the Americans, no opportunities, only survival. The Americans had so many aircraft, such overwhelming numbers, that individual skill barely mattered. You could be the best pilot in the world, but if 20 P-51s decided you were their target, you died. Simple as that. I was glad to return east. At least there, combat still made sense. The P-51 pilots, meanwhile, faced their own psychological challenges. Yes, they had superior numbers, excellent aircraft, and strategic momentum, but they were still flying combat missions over enemy territory, still risking death or capture with every sortie, still losing friends to enemy fire and mechanical failures and simple bad luck. Major George Preddy, the highest-scoring P-51 ace with 26.83 confirmed victories, the 83 came from shared kills, described the psychological complexity of combat. You're supposed to be a killer in the air, professional and efficient. But these aren't abstractions you're killing. They're pilots like you, men with families and hopes and fears. I shot down a 109 over Munich in August 1944. Beautiful day, clear skies, perfect visibility. I got good strikes on his engine. He bailed out. I watched his chute deploy, watched him floating down toward Germany below. Part of me was relieved he survived. Part of me was already moving to the next target. You can't dwell on it in combat. You can't think about the man, only the threat. But later, sitting in the barracks, it catches up. You remember faces. You wonder who he was, if he survived the landing, if he has kids who just lost their father. And then you push it down because you have to fly again tomorrow. Preddy was killed in December 1944, shot down not by German fighters but by American anti-aircraft fire in a tragic friendly fire incident. He survived the most dangerous missions, faced the Luftwaffe's best pilots, and prevailed, only to die from friendly fire on Christmas Day. The randomness, the injustice of it, the waste. These were the realities that statistics could never capture. The air war over Europe in 1944 was massive in scale, but intimate in experience. Yes, it involved thousands of aircraft and tens of thousands of personnel. Yes, it was won through industrial production, logistical superiority, and strategic planning. But ultimately it was fought by individual pilots, each one making split-second decisions, each one facing mortality with whatever courage and skill they could summon, each one carrying psychological scars that would last long after the shooting stopped. The P-51 Mustang gave Allied pilots the tool they needed to win that war. Range, performance, numbers, all essential. But the aircraft was just metal and mechanics. The men who flew it and the men who faced it gave meaning to those statistics, transformed strategic abstractions into lived human experience, and paid the cost that victory demanded. The Final Reckoning, Legacy of the Mustang. By autumn 1944, the Luftwaffe's fighter force over Western Europe had ceased to function as an effective strategic defensive force. Not destroyed entirely, thousands of German fighters still existed, and skilled pilots continued to inflict casualties on Allied bomber formations. But the coherent, coordinated defense system that had previously contested American air superiority had been shattered beyond repair. The numbers told the story with brutal clarity. In September 1944, the Luftwaffe lost 1,078 fighter pilots killed, wounded, or captured on the Western Front, against a replacement pilot production of approximately 600 per month. The mathematics of attrition had become inexorable. Each month consumed more than could be replaced. Each combat loss removed not just a pilot, but often an experienced pilot whose replacement was inadequately trained and would likely die within weeks of reaching an operational unit. German aviation fuel production, pounded by repeated Allied attacks that P-51 escorts made routine, had collapsed to approximately 10% of 1943 levels. Jet fighters, the Me-262, which possessed performance superior to any Allied fighter, sat on airfields unable to fly for lack of fuel. Pilots with minimal flight time were thrust into combat because there was no fuel for advanced training. The entire system was spiraling toward complete dysfunction. Adolf Galland, looking back after the war, pinpointed the turning point with precision. The introduction of the long-range P-51 escort fighter was the decisive development of the air war. Before the Mustang, we could still contest American bomber raids with some hope of success. After March 1944, we were fighting a delaying action with inadequate forces against an enemy who could strike anywhere in Germany with near impunity. The Mustang didn't just defeat us tactically, it defeated us strategically by eliminating the defensive advantages geography had provided. The strategic implications extended far beyond aerial combat statistics. With absolute air superiority established over Western Europe by late 1944, the Allies could support the D-Day invasion with overwhelming air power, could interdict German supply lines and reinforcements, could isolate the battlefield, and create conditions where Allied ground forces held every advantage except perhaps desperation. The collapse of German air defenses contributed directly to the collapse of German ground defenses in France, Belgium, and ultimately Germany itself. Historians debate many aspects of World War II, which battles were decisive, which strategies were optimal, which leaders deserve credit or blame. But there's remarkable consensus about the P-51 Mustang's role. It was one of the most strategically significant aircraft of the war, perhaps of any war. Not because it was the fastest or most heavily armed or most maneuverable fighter, it wasn't necessarily any of those things, but because it could do something no other fighter could do: escort bombers to any target in Europe and back, maintaining combat effectiveness throughout the mission. That single capability changed everything. Consider the counterfactual. What if the Mustang had never been developed, or had been delayed by a year, or had proven ineffective? The Allied bombing campaign would have continued, certainly, but at what cost? Loss rates of 15 to 20% on deep penetration raids were mathematically unsustainable. Either the campaign would have been curtailed, or bomber losses would have continued at catastrophic levels. Either outcome would have extended the war, cost more lives, potentially changed the strategic balance in ways impossible to predict. The P-51 Mustang was, in this sense, a strategic weapon disguised as a tactical aircraft. Yes, it shot down German fighters and protected bombers, tactical roles, but its real impact was strategic. It enabled a bombing campaign that destroyed German industrial capacity, fuel production, transportation networks, and ultimately the Wehrmacht's ability to sustain operations across multiple fronts. The indirect effects of air superiority, Disrupted logistics, isolated battlefields, destroyed infrastructure were at least as important as the direct effects of bombing. Captain Don Gentile, reflecting on his wartime experience years later, captured this broader significance. We thought we were just protecting bombers, shooting down German fighters, doing our jobs. We didn't realize at the time that we were part of something larger, a systematic campaign that was destroying Germany's ability to wage war. The Mustang gave us the reach to make that campaign possible. Without it, I don't know how the war would have ended. I just know it would have taken longer and cost more lives. The human cost of the air war remained staggering regardless of who ultimately won. The 8th Air Force suffered approximately 26,000 killed in action, the highest casualty rate of any American military unit in any theater of World War II. The RAF Bomber Command lost over 55,000 aircrew. The Luftwaffe lost tens of thousands of pilots. German civilians died by the hundreds of thousands in bombing raids. The numbers are almost incomprehensible in their scale. But within those statistics lived individual human stories, pilots who survived, pilots who didn't, families destroyed, cities ruined, lives irrevocably altered. The P-51 Mustang was a tool in that vast machinery of destruction and liberation, efficient and deadly, revolutionary and necessary. It helped win the war. It helped save civilization from fascism. And it helped kill tens of thousands of people in the process. There's no reconciling those contradictions, no simple moral calculus that makes the accounts balance. War is not algebra. The Mustang was both salvation and scourge, liberator and destroyer, technological marvel and instrument of death. All of these things simultaneously, all of these things truly. Franz Stigler, the German pilot who watched P-51s appear over Berlin on March 4, 1944, survived the war. He emigrated to Canada afterward, became a successful businessman, tried to leave the war behind. In 1990, he tracked down an American B-17 pilot he'd escorted to safety over Germany in 1943 instead of shooting down, a moment of humanity amid the slaughter. The two men became close friends, a friendship that lasted until both died in 2008, within months of each other. Stigler reflected in later years on that March day when he first saw Mustangs over Berlin. I knew in that moment the war was lost, not politically. I'd believed for some time we would lose, but militarily, definitively, irreversibly lost. The Americans could reach Berlin. They could go anywhere. We couldn't stop them. Everything that followed, the defeats, the retreat, the collapse, was inevitable from that point forward. Sometimes I wonder if that knowledge, that certainty, made the next year of fighting feel surreal. We were going through the motions of a war already lost, fighting battles whose outcomes had already been decided in the moment American fighters appeared over the Reich's capital. The P-51 Mustang flew its last combat mission in the Korean War, where it served briefly before being superseded by jet fighters. Many were scrapped after the war, sold as surplus, or converted for civilian racing. A few hundred survive today, most in museums, some still flying at air shows where they dazzle crowds with their speed and grace and beauty. They're elegant machines, these surviving Mustangs, polished and pristine, divorced from the violence and terror and chaos they were built to deliver. But for the men who flew them and the men who faced them, the P-51 Mustang remains inseparable from one of history's most consequential air campaigns. It was the fighter that reached Berlin, the fighter that escorted bombers all the way to the target and back, the fighter that broke the Luftwaffe's defensive strategy and established Allied air superiority over Europe, the fighter that changed the war. Not alone, never alone. The Mustang was part of a vast combined arms campaign involving millions of people, thousands of aircraft, countless strategic decisions, and tactical innovations. But within that vast machinery, the P-51 held a unique place. The weapon that made possible what was previously impossible, that transformed theory into reality, that proved engineers and pilots and planners right when they dared to imagine that distance itself could be conquered. On a cold March morning in 1944, German pilots looked up and saw American fighters over Berlin. Impossible. Yet there they were. And in that moment, Everything changed. The sanctuary of distance collapsed. The protective buffer of geography disappeared. The war in the air over Europe was fundamentally, irreversibly transformed. One aircraft, one revolutionary innovation, one day that marked the beginning of the end. The Germans thought their air defense was safe. The P-51 Mustang proved them catastrophically wrong, and the war would never be the same. Epilogue echoes through time. The aluminum skin of a restored P-51D Mustang catches afternoon sunlight at an air show in 2024, 80 years after the first escort missions to Berlin. The aircraft is pristine, maintained with obsessive care by volunteers who understand they're preserving more than a machine. They're keeping alive a piece of history that changed the world. Children press against the restraining ropes, parents snap photographs. Veterans in their 90s approach with tears in their eyes, remembering friends who never came home, remembering missions flown in aircraft exactly like this one. The pilot fires up the Merlin engine. That sound, the distinctive throaty roar of 1,500 horsepower channeled through 12 cylinders and a two-stage supercharger, is instantly recognizable to anyone who's heard it before. It's the sound of power, of engineering pushed to its limits, of an era when piston engine fighters represented the cutting edge of aviation technology. The Mustang taxis, takes off, climbs steeply into the clear blue sky. The pilot puts the aircraft through a routine, rolls, loops, high-speed passes that showcase the Mustang's speed and agility. From the ground, it's entertainment, a glimpse into history, a reminder of the greatest generation and their sacrifices. But for those who knew the Mustang in war, the demonstration carries different weight. The aircraft isn't playing. It's remembering. Every maneuver is an echo of combat, of desperate fights at 25,000 feet, of pilots pushing themselves and their machines to the edge of destruction. The beauty of the aerobatics masks the reality of what these aircraft were built to do: kill and protect, destroy and preserve, deliver violence with precision and purpose. Robert Johnson, Chuck Yeager, George Preddy, Don Gentile, the names of P-51 pilots who became aces are preserved in books and museums and Air Force histories. Franz Stiegler, Hans-Joachim Jabs, Johannes Steinhoff, the names of German pilots who faced them are remembered too, if less prominently in English language histories. These were the men who lived the revolution in aerial combat that the Mustang enabled, who experienced firsthand the transformation from a war where German fighters dominated to a war where Allied air superiority was absolute. Most of them are gone now. The last World War II combat pilots are in their late 90s or have already passed. Soon there will be no one left who remembers what it felt like to fly combat missions over Germany, to watch contrails mark the sky over Berlin, to experience the terror and exhilaration of aerial combat at 400 miles per hour and 25,000 feet. But the aircraft endure. And with them, the story. The story of how engineering innovation, strategic vision, and human courage combined to create a weapon that changed the course of history. The story of how one aircraft, not dramatically superior to its adversaries in any single dimension, but revolutionary in its combination of range and performance, fundamentally altered the strategic balance of World War II. The P-51 Mustang reached Berlin. That simple fact, that seemingly modest achievement, contained within it the collapse of German air defenses, the enablement of the strategic bombing campaign, the establishment of Allied air superiority, and ultimately a significant contribution to victory in Europe. The Germans thought their air defense was safe behind the buffer of distance. The Mustang demolished that assumption in a single day, and nothing was ever the same again.